Hello again. Last time we talked about Jacob and Esau, and today we're going to follow the story of Jacob and what happens to Jacob and where God leads his life and where he ends up. Last time he had to leave his home. If you remember, he had tricked his father, and his brother Esau was so angry that his parents sent him away. On his way, he was scared. He was so scared because his brother Esau was angry, and he knew how well his brother Esau could hunt, and he was afraid that his brother Esau might hunt him down before he cooled off. Well, he ran and he ran and he ran until he couldn't run anymore, and he was so tired. He finally stopped at this spot, and there was this stone there, and it wasn't a big rock. It was more of a smaller stone, and he laid down and he used that stone for a pillow. And he was so tired and he was so frightened, he just fell right asleep. And when he was sleeping, God gave him a dream. Maybe you've heard of this before, Jacob's ladder. God gave him a dream of this ladder, and somehow Jacob could see that the ladder extended from earth all the way up into heaven. That would be really cool to see. Get a glimpse into heaven. I would like that. This ladder was going all the way up into heaven. And then he could see these angels coming down the ladder and angels going up the ladder. You're like, that's so cool. And later we learned this represents the angels are taking God's messages from the people to God and back from heaven, back down to the earth. It's just a symbol about messages coming to and from God. But God made a promise to Jacob that night. He says, if you will just trust me, I will always be with you, and I will bless you, and you will multiply, and your descendants and their children will be so many, just like my promise to your grandfather Abraham. Jacob woke up, and he remembered the dream, and he remembered the promise from God, and he calmed down. If God's going to give me a promise like that, I don't have to be so afraid of my brother Esau. Sure enough, he continued on his way, and he made his way back to the same family as his mother. His mother's brother's name was Laban, so that would be his uncle. He made his way back to that family, and he got there and he saw these women at the well, just like his father's servant Eleazar. And he saw these women there, and he saw this one woman in particular, and she was drop dead gorgeous. She was beautiful. And he instantly fell in love with her. Her name was Rachel, right? Now Rachel had a sister, Leah. Leah was the older sister. And now we're going to talk about these customs again, like we did last time I told you a story. One of the customs of their culture was the older sister would get married first. And then the next sister down would get married, and then the next sister down. And there's still a lot of families today that will do that. Maybe not where we live, but in other countries. Some of you may have heard the story called Fiddler on the Roof. And in that story, in the Jewish culture, the older daughter needed to get married first before the middle daughter and then the younger daughter. Right? So it's nothing new, but it goes back a long, long, long time. And that was the custom of this family too. Well, Jacob fell in love with Rachel, who is the younger sister. Right? And so he went and introduced himself to their family, and Laban immediately welcomed them in. It was their custom to open up their doors, especially to family. And he was so excited to hear about his sister, because his sister had left so many years before to go marry Isaac. So they made this agreement. They said that Jacob would work for Laban. Jacob needed a job. That worked out well. Jacob had nowhere to go. Jacob could stay with them. And even better, Jacob fell in love with Rachel, right? So Jacob would work for Laban, Rachel's father, for 7 years. And then they could get married. You see, Laban is thinking, oh, 7 years. I mean, surely by then, Leah will be married off, and then it's no problem. Rachel can get married, right? But there is this other problem. Leah had a crush on Jacob as well. Both sisters liked the same guy. That's always going to cause trouble. Don't ever get into that kind of situation. Well, Jacob was so in love with Rachel. Those 7 years passed so fast. And 7 years went by, and finally Jacob came back, and he's like, okay, it's time. I'm ready to get married. And Laban's like, oh, it is time. Wow, man. I was thinking you might, maybe you'd work here for a longer period of time. Jacob's like, no, I'm ready. I want to get married now. And so Laban agreed, and they had this big wedding, and it was a huge special thing. And then Laban pulled a mean, nasty trick. You see, Leah hadn't gotten married yet, and Leah still liked Jacob. And so Leah went to her father, and she's like, Father, Rachel can't marry Jacob. I mean, I haven't gotten married yet, right? So Laban says, okay, we'll work something out. Let's do this thing. They pulled a mean trick on Jacob. Somehow, Rachel was kept away. I don't know if they tied her hands behind her back and gagged her so she wouldn't make any noise, or maybe somebody took her to the other part of the city. I don't know. But she wasn't there. Leah was there. And you remember that custom that Rebecca had done where she covered her face completely so only the eyes could see? The same thing. Leah gets all dressed up as the bride, and her face is completely covered except for the veil where she can see out. And Jacob is so excited to finally get married, and he's thinking this is Rachel. And the next morning, when there's light and the darkness has gone away, and he looks and he sees, lo and behold, it's Leah. Oh, now he's angry. He storms out of his place, and he goes over to Laban, and he says, what have you done? And Laban's like, okay, calm down, don't worry, we'll work things out. How about you just work for me another 7 years, and then you can marry Rachel? And Jacob's like, I don't think so. That ain't going to happen. And so Jacob, they agree. After 1 week, then he will marry Rachel. And now Jacob is going to have 2 wives, Rachel and Leah. So after a week, he gets married again, but he had to agree to work for another 7 years. Now during these 7 years, Jacob starts discovering some trick. You see, he's a herder, right? Growing up at home, he had learned about the sheep and the goats, and he'd learned how to take care of them. And during these 7 years, Laban was so impressed because all of his herds of sheep and goats, and maybe they had cattle too, they had multiplied. They got bigger and bigger and bigger. And so then Jacob starts saying, okay, I'll keep working for you, but I need to start getting some of my own, right? Because at the end of the 7 years, I'm going to have a family to take care of. And so Laban's like, okay, how about this? Now Laban thought he knew how to take care of these sheep and goats, right? And about how they multiply. And he says, how about this? If any of them are spotted, you can have those. And if any of them are not spotted, you know, the solid ones, I get those. Now most of him were good-looking sheep or goats, and you know, and they breed and they create mostly solid white sheep, or occasionally he might get an all-black sheep, and with the goats too and stuff. And so Laban's like, okay, let's do this. So Jacob finally agrees. He's like, okay, fine. Now Jacob figured something out. He figured out how to put some special stuff in the water that these goats would drink, and then when they would multiply and reproduce, they would come out spotted. And so as they would have more and more goat kids and baby goats and stuff, they came out spotted, and Jacob would say, okay, that one's mine, and that one's mine, and that one's mine, and pretty soon his flocks grew and got bigger. He didn't know, Laban didn't know what Jacob was doing, and how come his flocks were getting so big. Well, anyways, time went by, and Jacob had children. He had Reuben and Levi or Levi, and he had Nathaniel. He had all kinds of children, and they his wife Leah would bear children, but Rachel didn't have any kids yet. And there was this whole sister-sibling thing. They were fighting amongst each other, but he had more children. Eventually, he had 10 children. And Jacob finally decided, he says, you know what? I think it's time for me to leave. I need to return back to my homeland. And I'm not sure how I can do that. He went and he talked to Laban, and Laban like, no, don't leave yet. Just stay here longer. And they kept talking, and another year would go by, and 20 years had gone by since Jacob had left. He had been married for now 13 years. He had at least 10 children, almost 11 children, and it was finally time for him to go. And so one of the times when he finally left, he tricked his father-in-law, and he took off, and they got a long ways out with all of his goats, with all of his sheep, with all of his kids, and with all of the things that he had accumulated. And they left. They got a little ways out, and Laban came running, catching up to them, and he's like, wait, what are you doing? And Jacob says, I'm sorry, it's time, I'm going. And Laban's like, okay, fine, but I'm missing some things, and I know that you took them. And Jacob's like, you can search. If you find them, you can have them, but I don't think you'll find them. Well, Laban went around, and he searched and searched and searched, and he never found his missing things. And finally, he's like, okay. They said their goodbyes, and Laban returned home, and Jacob kept going on his way. Now, after Jacob got past, he kept going, after he got past his meeting with his father-in-law Laban, there was something else that was heavy on his mind. If you remember the last story, what had happened? Jacob had tricked his brother and his father, right? And now Jacob's starting to return home, and he doesn't know what he's going to find. He doesn't know if his brother Esau is still mad after 20 years, or if things have cooled down. And he starts thinking about it, and he's praying. And they get closer, and they get closer, and he did something. He wasn't very brave, if you will. He heard that his brother was coming, and he starts regrouping all of the goats and the sheep, and he starts putting them up in front. And then he sends his two wives and their servant girls with him, and he sends them up ahead with the children up in front. And he's kind of hanging back as this whole train of people are moving along, and he just kind of hangs out in the back. And then finally he gets word, and he says, your brother Esau is close by, and he's got a bunch of men with him. Well, that night, Jacob went a little ways away from his camp, and he went to pray. Have you ever just gone out in the dark and looked up at the stars? I love going and looking up at the stars, and I feel so close to God when I do that. And here's Jacob, and he goes out and he starts calling out to God, and then he hears something. While he's there on his knees, he hears something, and somebody's close by. He's like, who's there? Who is it? He's calling around and he's looking. It's dark. You can see lots of stars. Maybe there's no moon. And here comes something. And all of a sudden, he starts wrestling with this other guy. And he's wrestling. He's like, he thinks it's Esau. And he's wrestling with it. And he's wrestling. Now, Jacob's a pretty strong guy. You see, years before, he had gone and he had pushed off the big heavy rock off of the well. And he had still been keeping care of all these things. And he's not a weak guy. He's strong. And this guy is wrestling with him in the night. And he's going back and forth. And he realizes this isn't just a guy. This is supernatural. And then he's like, let me go. Or no. He's hanging on to the other guy. And finally the other guy's like, let me go. Because it's almost, the sun's starting to come up and it's starting to get light. And he realizes something is happening. And then the other guy touches his hip. And all of a sudden Jacob feels this intense pain in his hip. He's like, oh, ouch. And he kind of falls and he grabs on. That's when he grabs on. And the other guy's like, let me go. And he's like, no. He realizes this must be an angel or maybe it's God himself. And he's holding on with all he can. And he says, I won't let you go unless you bless me. He had remembered the blessings from God. And right before he meets his brother Jacob, he wants reassurance once again that God is with him and God will bless him. And sure enough, he received a blessing that night. But he also received a hip injury. I don't know what it was. The other had touched his hip, and all of a sudden he felt this pain, and from there he started walking with a limp because of his hip. But he was no longer afraid of his brother Esau. He knew he had received once again a blessing from God. And sure enough, the next day, when Esau comes in, Jacob gets down and he's got his staff there. He's holding it because he still feels pain probably from that night. And he's sore from the wrestling and just waiting. And Esau comes up and he's looking at his brother's face. And then they smile and they embrace. They give each other a big hug. They haven't seen each other in 20 years. And Esau knew everything was really going to be okay. Once again, don't try and take things into your own hands. Always remember to trust God. God will always help you, no matter what your situation is. Even if you run away, like Jacob had done, God will always want you to come back, and he will always bless you if you give your life to him. I hope you have a great day. We'll see you next time.